Hi folks, you're with Tacitus today at your Pushback channel. This essay is about how the loss of social commercial trust is making the West poorer. Having done big ticket business all over the world on every continent and having seen mind-boggling poverty, the handiwork of brutal dictatorships, the most vulgar shows of affluence, and almost comical levels of corruption, to me at least, race and culture were always realities for which sensitivity, tact, and good manners were prerequisites, to be sure, but ultimately, doing business, the only colour was green. My private views on anything were irrelevant, and I firmly took the position that brown, black people should not be lectured to by visiting white folks or anyone else for that matter. There were, however, many times when I was relieved to be departing some of these third world places when the plane took off. And similarly, there was a sense of safety and familiarity and just a general well-being when the captain announced the preparation for landing at Sydney's Kingsford Smith International Airport as it came into view, and I would eagerly look out the window as the airport came into view. But I was coming back to some sort of sense of normalcy and reality. Perhaps not a view necessarily that I take today, but anyway, Australia and indeed the white West of today is about 63% white rather than the 90 to 98% white of 20 or so years ago. Now, this is a seismic population shift. Imagine that in the case of Australia going from 98% white to 63, 64% white in 20 or so years. This is incredible and over a very short space of time. And this is something unique in history insofar as previous migrant intakes, military invasion aside, have focused on how much the migrants have in common, that is, shared values with the existing population. Migration policies have always favoured migrants who had a lot in common with the existing population, who are more likely to integrate. Today, however, in regard to the mass migration, which is being forced upon us, shared values or social values in common are no longer requirements or even desirable qualities to become an accepted migrant to the West. The globalist dictated Western government migration policies are bringing in the planet's least compatible peoples to the West. Around 80% of migrants are sourced solely on the basis of where surplus populations are located in the world, such as India or the subcontinent generally, China, Africa. Almost without exception, the surplus populations are from peasant economies and importantly places where social commercial trust is very low or even non-existent outside of family or tribal units. We need to understand that the population of, say, the subcontinent is pushing 2 billion people, 95% of whom are dirt poor. So large numbers of immigrants from low trust societies who also have no other shared values with the existing Western populations are being brought into white and only white societies at an incredible pace. And you got a problem with that, you fascist, Nazi, bigot, xenophobe, racist, homophobe, misogynist? In Australia, some 5 million immigrants, mostly Chinese and from the subcontinent, have been accepted as migrants in less than 20 years. That represents more than 25% of Australia's population in the year 2000. Upon arrival, they go into full anchor baby mode, and it is far from unusual to see a recent migrant, obviously pregnant, with a child in a pram or stroller and a barely walking toddler on the hand. The migrant motto appears to be procreate but don't integrate. But the issue I'd like to particularly focus on in this essay, as mentioned above, is the issue of social, commercial, and particularly commercial trust. How migrants mass relocated to the West do business once they arrive. When migrants share many of the values of the existing population, they tend to integrate with the values they find around them. Similarly, with a moderate pace of migration, even those migrants from non-compatible or minimally compatible societies, they often integrate quite quickly because they don't really have alternatives. There's not enough of them to form racial ghettos or to fall back on the old ways of the old country, but that are very different, of course, from the Western ways. And so those options aren't available, so they tend to integrate. But in the West, however, today, and certainly in Australia, so vast and swift has been the rate of incompatible migration from low-trust societies. The migrant groups have been able to form and actively form parallel economies within the national Australian economy. We see the same thing happening in the United States with, say, Hispanics and so on. To understand social commercial trust, and by extension commercial compatibility in trust, it is worth noting the high trust societies of the world are the wealthiest and most orderly societies on the planet, with the super oil rich states and tax haven microstates as being outliers. Those societies with the least social trust are the poorest. It is also the case high levels of social commercial trust are rarities. They're not the norm in the world. They're quite rare and they take quite a while to develop. Communism, for example, is a reflection of a low trust society. All output must be pooled and shared out equally, according at least to the theory. Anything else is exploitation, yet the very act of communism as a means for human association or economic association reduces even further what little socio-commercial trust existed in the first place. And we can see this in as the Berlin Wall came down and the Iron Curtain came down in around 1990, that when people from those eastern from the former Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc countries started to move around the West, it was remarkable how low trust they had. No trust at all. That they had zero trust, and yet they were in a society that was meant to be fair and egalitarian and equal and so on. Yet it created an attitude of almost zero trust in the populace. To add to the low trust entrenched attitudes of the migrants, it's also equally entrenched attitudes regarding how money is made and how profits are derived, and importantly, how profits are to be shared. Those from low trust societies believe money is made by taking it from someone else. They think there's an existing pot of money that doesn't get bigger or smaller, it's absolutely static, and so the only way you can get more is by taking from someone else. So these low trust societies believe money is made by taking from someone else, swindling other people out of the money, and acts of deception. And they consider these as not only acceptable practices, but they actually see it as credentials for high-powered, kick-ass negotiation. If they swindle someone, particularly if it's a white person, they'll regard themselves as master negotiators rather than just someone that deceived and swindled another person. They may and often do draw the line at swindling family or the tribe members, but anyone else is fair game. The concept, which is very, very Western and very capitalist, the concept of making profits and doing well from innovation, invention, improvements in productivity, the proverbial building of the better mousetrap, are utterly foreign ideas in low trust societies. And they bring these low trust attitudes with them as migrants. And why wouldn't they? They've known nothing different. Similarly, the notion that those outside the family, tribe or racial ethnic group should benefit in any way from the commercial actions of the family or tribe, this is the migrant family or tribe, are also completely alien. They've come to the white countries to take, not to give. You just don't share the bounty outside of the family or tribe. It just simply isn't done. Others or non-family, non-tribe people are there to be taken from, not given to. Having visited numerous subcontinent and Chinese businesses in Australia and elsewhere, they rarely hire even one employee from outside their racial group. Local whites are only hired if it's absolutely unavoidable, and even then with grudging sufferance. A business owned by young wealthy Brahmins may hire young white girlies, low IQ girlies from the working class, blonde lower class, eye candy, but they're only there as trophies or conquests, and they do no real work, and they're easily dispensed of. In fact, these businesses, when it comes to accessing goods and services, will only do business with other businesses within their ethnic group. That is, when they're spending money, they only want to do it with people inside their group. They'll take money from whites, but they don't want to spend money where whites may benefit. They will happily sell to whites and take white money, but will not in return spend money at white-owned businesses other than, say, national retail chains. A Chinese businessman explained why he cannot do or cannot bring himself to do business with local whites in Australia. He says that in China he can control other people or business owners either through bribes or using the Communist Party crony system, or by use of family ties to threaten, shame or embarrass people, or via direct threats such as goons being sent over to slap someone around or threatening to target family members with violence. This businessman claims that such methods are not generally available and are a bit frowned upon when doing business with whites in the West, in Australia in this case. He adds he will never do business where he spends money rather than receives it with anyone unless he can hold something over them as a direct threat, such as family shaming or some other way of forcing what he would see as good behaviour and compliance. He believes good, and this is important at this point, he believes good behaviour in business cannot be voluntarily achieved. It must be bribed or threatened with heavy-handed action. People can't meet and mutually agree and voluntarily agree for a mutually beneficial transaction. A transaction can only take place if he's spending the money, if he can control it by threat or some other form of intimidation, or again, in the case of family members, shaming or embarrassing them. Trying to explain to such a person that apart from redress through courts, which are courts of law, are available in the West and not in the same way as they are in these third world countries, they're trying to explain to such a person, apart from redress through the courts for legal actions or say, breach of contract, for example, the primary threat, if we can call it that in the West, is for a business is to lose the customer. A successful business relies on winning new customers and keeping them happy by giving them doing quality work, giving them good value, good worthwhile products and services, and thus keeps the customer as a long-term customer, a long-term happy customer. Now, if the seller misbehaves in some way or annoys or pisses off the customer, then they lose that customer. The customer goes and does business with the folks down the road. Now, this is a powerful incentive for a business in the West to engage in agreeable and sensible commercial behaviour. But it's the sort of behaviour you see in a high trust society. In low trust societies, they don't conceive it that way because their concept of competition and so on is quite restricted. So the loss of a customer, they say, well, hey, so you screw someone over, you just find someone else. So they don't see that as in any way an incentive for good behaviour. Whereas in the West, we tend to assume the good intentions of the other party, and in order to keep them as customers, we expect that we have to do a good job for the customer in order to keep them and to keep them happy and coming back and doing business with us. But these people don't understand that. In a low trust society, there's no real concept of that. So people from low trust societies who are not required to integrate in the Western societies once they get here cannot conceive of mutually agreeable, acceptable commercial behaviour. They simply cannot bring themselves to assume the good intentions of the other party to a commercial transaction. And some of this is projection, of course. They're used to screwing and swindling and taking, and so they project that attitude into others and assume that everyone else is doing it. And of course, they've come to the West where that sort of, not that there aren't bad people here, there are, but that they cannot understand this concept of assuming the good intentions of the other party. Rather than recent immigrants changing to the high trust ways of the existing population in the West, and this is of great concern, in fact the reverse is occurring, and it is the local population that is losing its high trust commercial attitudes and beginning to descend into cronyism, bribery and patronage. And as one Chinese businessman pointed out, it's all this competition and trying to give the best price and trying to impress people with the services you offer. Why bother? Just bribe somebody, for goodness sake. It's the easiest and quickest way to get the job done. You know you've got control over the situation. None of this time wasting with having to deliver good quality services and product. Just bribe the crap out of whoever you can and you're good to go. And this is very much the attitude. And it's catching on in the West far more than we would have imagined. And an example of that, certainly in the US, would be the sort of things that the Joe Biden's son's getting up to, getting paid $600,000 a year, working for that, having his name on the list of that Ukrainian energy company. And he doesn't speak a word of Ukrainian and know anything about energy, and yet they're stumping up 600. It's that sort of cronyism and bribery is something that's increasing in the West, not decreasing. And the more people from low trust societies are brought into the West, the worse it appears to be becoming. This is very significant insofar as low trust attitudes either stop dead choice-based commercial transactions, that is the mutually agreed, mutually beneficial transaction, or substantially increases the cost of all commerce and related transactions because there needs to be extensive, very detailed contracts, lawyers are involved, so it takes a lot longer, it's more expensive. And the cost of these transactions, well, either no transactions occur or fewer ones do, or the cost increases. And you see the development of that in these very low trust African basket case economies. People outside of certain tribes and families just can't do business because the transaction cost is just too high. On the back hand, as competitive market profit opportunities dry up in such a low trust society, the opportunities also dry up to some extent for big capital, so the big globalist capital. As low trust attitudes permeate the entire social commercial structure, the big capital response then is to establish monopolies for all essential goods and services such as water, power, transport, road use, health services and so on. Such monopolies require much corruption at the political and public service level. This ensures big capital, through the monopolies, can still make its supranormal profits with a super low risk profile as the commercial society around it decays. Some argue that eventually over time these migrants do integrate and become westernised, sharing Western high trust commercial values. I guess this is possible, but it's very unlikely. For example, subcontinent immigrants who came to the West 150 years ago still insist they are Indians or Pakistanis first and foremost. They came 150 years ago. They're up to 6th or 7th generation born in the West, but they still say their genetic heritage is the issue here. They still send back to the tribal village of their ancestors for brides and husbands. They still employ and do business exclusively with other subcontinent people. A subcontinent business who employed only one local white person 10 years ago still only employs one white person today. They haven't changed at all. And in terms of integration, the wider issue of integration, it seems to be going into reverse here. A Western high school has caved to the demands of a vocal subcontinent migrant group and is now 98.9% subcontinent racially pure. It's got over 1,000 kids, for goodness sakes. In this school, the children have re-established a caste class system of dominance. So they've just transplanted the caste system from the country they came from and just brought it over into the West and just plonked it straight down in high school. And the education department went down like a sack of potatoes and agreed to everything. So the integration prospects for the future, whether it be at a commerce level or a social level, are certainly not promising given the sort of migration that's coming to the West now. And the cost of this will be monumental for the West in terms of reduced living standards, parallel economies running, underground economies and so on. So not a bright future if this continues, and it really needs to be addressed by the politicians that you vote for. You've been Tacitus today, and thank you for listening.